Um, so I am going to go through the talk, and as we go through this, there's going to be lots of notes in the slide deck. As we've noticed, these slide decks are published for your benefit. So I'm going to go through the process, level setting, do's and don'ts. I have some advice that I went and got from some other people in the business who've been doing this kind of stuff a long time. So, and I've done a lot of this stuff, as Phil mentioned. I did leave the abstract in here so that when you go get the PDF at some point, you'll know what the talk was about, just for posterity's sake. So let's kick this off and tell you what the agenda for the half an hour is going to be. I'm going to go over the core concepts of what's in vulnerability management, what's in, what's not in, what sounds like it's part of vulnerability management but isn't. We'll talk about defining a vulnerability management program with a simple guiding stepwise process for you to get started. I'll talk a lot about learning your environment and learning how to interact with the people in your environment, and some very good and bad lessons learned along the way to support your program. I've experienced a lot of gotchas in this business, in this part of IT and IT security management. I have encountered some resistance. I have a couple of war stories to share with you, and some field advice, and to give you some paths to overcome some of those things that you will probably encounter as you go down this road. So the first thing we want to level set on is, what is a vulnerability assessment and what is vulnerability management? A vulnerability assessment is very close to a threat assessment, right? But you're going to look at a given system, and a system could be a gold image of an operating system. It could be a web-facing order entry system. It could be anything, but it has a boundary to it. So when you're doing a vulnerability assessment, you're looking at something with a boundary, and you want to look at all of the aspects of that system: its software, its operating system, its database, its web-facing components, if it talks out to the internet and makes a web service call lookup, anything of that nature, and how it exchanges data. Because the majority of the IT systems that we work with, in some way, shape, or form, either consume data that comes into them, or they output data for some managerial decision. And hand in hand with this, and some of the things that have happened over the last several years, we always need to be looking at the underlying libraries that many of these systems, particularly systems based on Linux, actually leverage and utilize. That is an important part of vulnerability assessment. It's not just the app, it's everything that makes it up and the libraries that go in behind it. That's what vulnerability assessment is. It's also another thing about VA is its point in time. We're doing this on, say, March 23rd, just to have a date. Vulnerability management is a different story. It's an ongoing and repeatable process. So you're going to do things that occur time in and time out. They're cyclical. Their mission and their objective is to find, fix, and remediate any found vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the systems that you have deployed, okay? So, and in the next slide, I'll give you some idea what the vulnerability landscape looks like. But one of the differences in assessment and management is, at assessment time, you knew the vulnerabilities, what the best you could find out, that could have been deployed against those components at that point in time. In the vulnerability management world, the vulnerabilities that can be deployed against an operating system, a component, a database, a web application, an underlying library, those are constantly changing. So the landscape changes. So when you think about vulnerability management, there's a bigger picture. Now, another core concept, and I have this topic in every single talk that I do, because I don't think that we in the security space do enough of a good job understanding and communicating to the business. So in my way of thinking, and what I've developed is value chain analysis in everything that we do as security people. If you can understand your value chain, you are being business relevant. And that is important. And particularly if you're new to the cyber field, it's not just about the cool techno thingy that you're working on. And the cool techno thingy is important because it kind of gets us jazzed and gets us excited. But what makes us relevant to the business is understanding what they care about and how we can better their ability to conduct business. So let me give you the formal definition of the value chain. It comes from a guy named Michael Porter in the mid 80s. If you're an MBA type grad, you heard this in college. The value chain is the set of activities that a firm or an organization are operating in a specific industry perform to create a valuable product, good, or service in their marketplace for the end customer. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on a coming up slide. Vulnerability assessment and vulnerability management is not just running a scanner. That's not what this is. That's a very small component of these whole programs. It's not performing a pen test, although performing a pen test will help you find misconfigurations and other problems, and may in fact be enabled, the actual penetration testing exercise, by executing against a technical vulnerability. So you will have parts of this, but it's not the same thing as vulnerability management. We need a program that's important to us because the enterprise scale is huge, okay? Especially today, data moves freely to and from someone else's cloud. I mean, the division that I work for at RSA, we have products that take client data and come into the cloud for analysis, and we send them back. So we're doing this, okay? So that's part of our vulnerability management program, okay? So I wanted to give you an idea of how big the space is. So I went and got some statistics. And of course, when you get the PDF version of this, those links at the bottom are clickable references, so you know where this information comes from. At the end of last year, there were over 20,000 known vulnerabilities in the US CERT vulnerability database. But please don't think that that's the total size of all known vulnerabilities, because in order to get in the vulnerability database, you have to be able to describe it, explain it, show what it relates to, has to be somewhat valid. I mean, you don't just get listed in the CERT vulnerability database. There has to be some stuff behind it, okay? That is a 9.3% YOY. That stands for year over year increase in 2020. And I put that on there specifically to mention early in the talk as I go through these things that you will have to figure out for your organization what measures make a difference. A lot of what the business does is it looks at its performance for in this quarter versus last quarter, this quarter versus this quarter last year, or this time in this month versus the previous month, because businesses are executing on various programs to gain more market share, to improve their product lines, to sell more stuff. That's what they do. Like I just read yesterday where Starbucks is putting in the next month, they anticipate over 2,000 new Starbucks locations in China, something like one every 13 hours or something like that. So they're expanding that market, and that is one of their measures, the number of outlets they have. When you dig into what's behind these numbers, the real telling number here is the last one. 55% of what's in there could be executed and exploited with no elevated access or higher than user privilege. And unfortunately, that's down from the prior year. So that means as an industry, we got better. The next thing you want to look at is what is the top stuff that happened last year? What were the top things being exploited? There wasn't a single 0 day that made it into the top 30. Attacking organizations, APT groups, knowledgeable attackers, nation state actors, all those various ways we talk about to describe the bad guys. They didn't burn their 0 days. They're not going to do that. They're going to try to find an adequate persistent threat. APT, that's kind of what it stands for, adequate persistent threat, because the patching and the fixing and the resolving of vulnerabilities kind of lags behind their announcement, all right? If you look at what was the biggest thing that was exploited in 2020, these are retrospective analyses. You can't really do the retrospective for 2022 because we're a third of the way through it, or a fourth of the way through it. The most thing that was exploited in 2020 was a vulnerability that was discovered at the tail end of 2019, with the final fixes out within a few weeks into 2020, yet it was the thing that was most exploited throughout that prior year. That's some idea of the problem space we're dealing with, and how do you engage to solve this area? You have to go learn about your environment. When you're going and learning about your environment, that gives you a plan as to how you're going to engage. You have to know what the likely threats are. I like to compare vulnerability management to a fence around a pool. In the state that I live in the US, you are required to have some form of fence around your backyard pool to prevent accidents from happening, children drowning, animals drowning, stuff like that. So if you think about the pool as the desired item, particularly in August, and the fence as being that protective barrier, how strong is that barrier? Will it keep your average adult height person out? Will it keep a 4-year-old out? Will it keep a dog out? Is the gate closed? So think about that. How are you going to engage? And that's, what are the likely threats? You want to be able to identify the vulnerabilities, which is usually performed through some sort of scanning or passive analysis, evaluate what the information you get back is, try to connect the dots, look at more than what the tool tells you. I have a great example of how two low vulnerabilities became a critical issue that I'll share with you in a few minutes. Be prepared to evaluate these results and defend them. One of the challenges that you'll experience trying to do vulnerability management is people will tell you that's not real or that can't happen. So some of the things you might have to do some of that really cool stuff and fire up your copy of Metasploit and actually show that yes, this can be exploited, and yes, we can gain privileged access to the system and prove those things out. It's one of the things that you may have to do in a very safe manner at some point in working on these programs. Once you know the results and you've stacked and forced rank them, you have to test, remediate, and protect your environment based on what you found. And then you have to report out. Now, there's a variety of ways to go learn. And a lot of this stuff really requires asking good questions. Like we talked about value chain analysis a minute ago. If you manufacture gypsum board, you have raw materials, you have an assembly line, that material goes through a process where it's ground and heated and cooled and moisturized and all that stuff, and it's made into what we normally call sheetrock. And if you've ever looked at one of these assembly lines, they're 800 feet long. They are enormous, and they have all kinds of industrial control equipment that make that assembly line work. And then you have all the logistics to get it out in the field. Well, that's important to that business because without their ability to manufacture that item, they don't have any sales. So that's part of their value chain. You know, if we looked at any industry out there, any organization out there, you want to look at what does it take to bring things in? What are the IT systems that support all the things that you're doing, and use those IT systems that support the activity to determine where you want to engage to protect the IT systems, okay? Hopefully you have an application portfolio. If you don't have an application portfolio, seize the day, and as you learn more about your environment to do a vulnerability management program, help to develop one, which that is a hugely valuable resource. What apps and servers and databases does an individual application or application suite depend on? If you have a business continuity or disaster recovery plan, that is a roadmap, because that is a prioritized view of all of the systems that your organization cares about, and the servers and databases and things that make them up. Just how much SaaS and cloud do you own? Okay, you may have a lot more than you think. We call this shadow IT. And how do you find out about how technology, how is it introduced? My personal favorite one and how technology is being introduced in your organization is a service desk ticket that comes in that says, I need an export of all the email addresses so we can send an invitation for everybody to start using this new SaaS application that we just bought. Yeah, you heard it right. I've had that happen in 2 or 3 environments. And when you go dig into it, you find out that they just bought something. They're going to be using critical business process with it. They're going to be doing uploads and downloads. And oh, by the way, that application you bought doesn't have multi-factor authentication, and we can't actually plug it into our SAML authentication process. So we've just created a real weakness. So we have to develop compensating controls. Connecting with your procurement team, understanding what purchases are being made. It's a joy to hear from your procurement team that says, hey, look, hey, security team, before we buy this new thingamajig, do you think it's a good idea if we move the entire project management organization to a SaaS provider that has a data center in South America? Of course, this would be from a United States or North America point of view. Maybe a good idea, may not. So you got to learn about your environment. There's all kinds of technical ways you can learn about your environment. And there's some do's and don'ts here. You can just go scan the network. You know, think about scanning light and then scanning more in depth, because you don't want to roll over hardware. There are some inexpensive open source scanners. OpenVAS, I think it's called Greenbone nowadays. It's a nearly low cost vulnerability scanning tool. You could go ahead and use that. And before you go buy a more expensive, more capable commercial system, you can ask your operating system. You can ask your operating system in multiple ways. You can run a PowerShell command against all of your Windows environment if it's enabled, and get the inventory of installed software. You can go ahead and ask your directory system or your software deployment tool, your asset inventory system, give me the list of applications that are in our environment. When I worked for a large insurance company, we did that. we found that there were over 6,800 applications deployed. Sounds like a lot, but when you decompose that down to just the name of the app, you ended up with around 300, because how we got from 300 to 6,000 is not everybody had the same version on the systems. So, don't be overwhelmed by the data. Always step back from that data and see what it's telling you and how you can wrap your arms around it, okay? Once you've done some learning, then go commercial. There's dozens of systems out there. Just some examples: Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7. There's lots of options out there, but use some of these basic techniques here in order before you go buy a commercial system. You will probably find in your environment that you have some protected enclaves or some network segments that some people in IT can reach, but you can't, or your vulnerability scanner can't, because they're off on some kind of DMZ or some kind of protected network segment because they do something specific. And you may think you scanned everything until you find out there's 300 member servers or systems in some kind of work group mode that's on this thing called the partner DMZ that no one ever told you about. I've experienced that, little joy in my life as well. Passive discovery with a next generation firewall can be hugely valuable for you to learn what kind of SaaS applications you're using, what kind of enterprise apps are going across your network. The Fortinet and Palo Alto are examples that can just listen to the network and have really good application sense. Snort and Suricata can also do app sense as well if you can figure out how to do a TLS interception on those platforms. You will have to do authenticated and unauthenticated scans. And you want to do an unauthenticated scan because you want to know what you can see as an attacker who could get into your environment and start scanning as a low privilege user from the system. You want to do an authenticated scan because you want to get an inventory. And for major cloud providers, the best way to learn and discover about the major cloud provider is get the billing report. Hopefully, on your billing report, whoever created an account or provisioned some assets in your cloud environment, hopefully they tagged that resource with a name, a project number, a department, or in really good shape, an actual cost center, because somebody pays attention to a cost center. Where I work, we have cost centers for everything. We have thousands of them, and everything is tagged, so we know what expense is tied to what. There are some pain points that you will encounter, okay? Yes, you can roll over hardware. You can roll over industrial control hardware. A lot of ICS hardware has been in place. And by ICS hardware, we're talking about a sensor, some sort of control system like the gypsum board example, the things that are monitoring the line where they're manufacturing this stuff, or like a petroleum plant where they're measuring flow, those sorts of things. Industrial control environments, they're not put in for a year or two. They're put in for 10, 15, 20 years. And that technology may have been in place for a very, very long time. So you could roll over an asset, so you have to be very careful, especially those types of environments. You will need authenticated or credentials to run authenticated scans, and you're very likely to need lots of authenticated credentials if you have what I would call a data island or an information island. That's those 5 systems that are existing in their own directory or their own work group because they do one thing and they do one thing well, but they're not part of the main directory. So you would discover them. Hopefully you asked and you got information, but you will need a credential specifically for those systems. So this may take you a long time depending on how many, what we call snowflakes, exist in your environment. Most backend Linux systems are snowflakes. They tend to be built for a specific purpose. They do a particular thing, like they run the Oracle database that your company uses, and then you're going to have to go get a credential for that system, okay? Another little point here, and this is a real pain point, lessons learned when you deal with these programs. Vulnerability scan results provide an exploit roadmap that the attacker or the adversary did not have to figure out how to get that tool in your environment. People have an amazing tendency to email these things around, particularly if you have a data owner in your organization that is using a third-party consultancy, and they just said, oh, well, John at company X is the one managing that for us. They have a 10-person team, and they just email the vulnerability report. That's not really a good idea, because you just took very sensitive data that exposes all the secrets of your network and you send it off to somebody else. Who knows what they're going to do with it? So this is something you have to be very careful about. You know, the better environments will post VA scan results or communicate over email a particular list of issues and then tell you, come here to the system to go see your stuff online and deal with it that way. So you can put the information in someone's hands, but you're not sending a report out. Just who owns that asset? You have a whole list here of ways to identify assets on the network. Shadow IT, various host names that may mean something. You have production, pre-production, dev, QA, customer support, all kinds of ways to describe environments. The other thing I want to tell you that's a real pain point, and I've seen this go very negative, and if you have an asset owner and you ask them to fix a vulnerability on Monday and they fix it on Tuesday, whether they told you about it or not, and you report that out as that is unfixed on Friday, you will make an enemy. I have actually seen this happen, and I've seen very colorful language expressed. So if you're doing these sorts of things and people are taking responses and they're taking you seriously, it is very important that you figure out how to give them credit for based on your scanning and your reporting frequency. A wise man, Eric Conrad, in our SEC 503 or 530 class talks about always get your measurements first. How big is your problem? Like the slide I showed you a minute ago. Then do your work. So as you're producing your measurements, you can say at the beginning of March, we had 400 switches that had 26 issues. At the beginning of July, we have 14 switches that have 12 issues left, and we've been able to deal with all these. So you show progress. There's a point here on this line that says free and open source software. I mentioned earlier, you do need to care about the libraries, Shellshock, Heartbleed, and last year, the Log4Shell, the Log4j exploit. Those are all examples where the web-facing app itself wasn't vulnerable. It was an underlying library that someone could get to that was vulnerable. So you really do have to be aware of the free and open source. That's what FOSS stands for. What's going on in your environment. Avoid single tool thinking, particularly in the web scanning space. Not every vulnerability assessment tool scans everything exactly the same way. Certain things will do a very good job leaving a trace behind, certain things will not. Some things treat different things differently, how they work. You'll probably need multiple tools. There's a number of inexpensive or free tools that you can use. Sharing is a great example. You can just go and say, how many Windows shares on my network are easily accessible by everyone? And you don't have to buy a fancy tool for that. And that's not a technical vulnerability, that's a configuration vulnerability. And the real thing is you have to be able to read the results and understand, okay? And like I said earlier, people will eventually challenge you at some of these results. That's gonna happen. So you may have to develop some skills to actually exercise something in a very, very careful manner, very, very carefully selected. Ratings can be subjective. If you look at what Microsoft says, they don't really rate anything as critical unless you can get, I believe it is unauthenticated remote code execution. That's their measurement of critical. So people could say and write in a policy, we deal with critical vulnerabilities, and the response is, well, they didn't rate it as critical, so we didn't have to patch it. It's not really the case. You have to make sure that you can explain what criticality is for you, okay? Here's a couple of slides now where I asked a few friends and colleagues and I got some opinion. I'm going to do my best to kind of repeat that for you. I've got a friend of mine who worked for a Fortune 50 apparel company, Global Scope. She said that the biggest problem she ever had was who owns what and trying to keep track of that. And I got a lot of humor out of how one of the things that she also told me is that stop doing vulnerability management and Excel spreadsheets. Yeah, got to have a better answer because that's extremely cumbersome to do it that way. Your scanning and your reporting should be on the same frequency. Scan monthly, report monthly. Don't get those two things out of sync because you want to make sure that when you're talking about things and explaining stuff, they go together. Vulnerability scanners don't find everything. And this second bullet on here is that example I mentioned earlier where the configuration issue was a huge vulnerability. And I've seen this twice in two large environments. One environment, and the idea is you have some sort of mechanism to send files in anonymously. Many organizations do this. You have some way for someone to send you data, or maybe there's a light authentication. Simply go register for your email address that's not validated, and then you can send us this data. And if that same drop-off directory is somehow visible in a directory browsing environment, what you did was you created what's called a WHERES server. I realize that's a term that probably many of you don't know today, but Phil and I have been around for a long time, and we remember WHERES servers from many moons ago. That's where you basically become someone else's file share way back when. And those sorts of things have happened in cloud space and blob space as well. You can be agile. My colleague Wes said, look, in our environment, they follow agile. So what they do is as vulnerabilities come in, they put them on a Scrum board. The development team chooses 5 vulnerabilities to patch per week. They have an independent sprint, a daily stand-up relating to dealing with a vulnerability. And what Wes explained is by making vulnerability management manageable, these small tasks show small wins, and the team is making overall progress. So it's another valuable technique. As a vulnerability manager working in this field, you do need some soft skills. These are important. You will have to influence and establish realistic patch timelines. You're going to have to decide when you can and should push and when you should not. You're going to have to understand the threat landscape, what in fact is a threat or not. You're also going to figure out how to keep current. I read a notice this morning that was posted. Somebody just posted some amazing research that was done earlier this week that explains how attackers can establish persistence as Windows services without actually using any of the normal API calls. I found it fascinating. So your mechanism for keeping current on threats is important. Having a variety of IT skills in your background is helpful. I've done web programming, database, billing, managed networks, system replacement, a lot of security stuff. I've been around a while, as you can tell. So I find that background to be very, very helpful. You will have to write to an audience at various technical levels. Okay, that's important. If the person is a senior level manager, you don't want to go into the techno blab and talk about all the CVEs and give them screenshots of your Metasploit tool. You want to explain something in terms that they understand. So know your audience makes a lot of difference. How do you measure success here in these programs? An example from one of the recent SANS blog posts, there's a link on the slide for you. Look at scanner coverage. Your environment will be ever changing. It will constantly change. Things are added and removed. I just did a move of a network over the weekend. We took 22U worth of hardware from one floor to the next and rearranged everything and moved it all around because we're not going to be using a floor anymore. So, all that stuff changed, all its management addresses changed, that kind of stuff. And every organization goes through that. Look at the number of criticals based on your risk. Look at the number of things that you closed. Ticketing systems are very valuable. If you have exclusions and tolerate them, how often do you have that? History repeats itself. Here are some examples for you. You can research these on your own later. My buddy Terry, one of the pieces of feedback he said was, if you talk about things in terms of risk that to the business, you'll get more mileage out of that. I like the idea that Terry suggested about having a Rosetta Stone. Developers, IT, and security all talk about the same thing differently. And knowing that we all talk about stuff differently can really, really be helping you. At kind of the end here, I have some resources. These will be links that are accessible in the PowerPoint deck in the last minute as I kind of finish up my talk. Please realize that nearly every vendor that you work with, not everybody, but they have some sort of ways for you to keep track of and be alerted, some way of learning about something. So, what's in your app portfolio, what's in your technology portfolio, and how can you be current? Oracle has a notice. Microsoft doesn't. Randy Franklin Smith is a guy, one example of a guy who's taken on the charge of that gap. And he provides a great newsletter. SANS has a number of very useful newsletters that come out that can help you. At Risk is a weekly summary of newly discovered attack vectors. I personally find it to be very, very valuable. Whenever At Risk comes in, I read it, pretty diligently. The Ouch newsletter comes out usually about monthly. Lots of interesting things there. I gave you a couple examples of Carnegie Mellon, OWASP. They have some vulnerability management samples to go by. And there's the US government's National Cyber Awareness System that you can get all kinds of good data from that. And I believe, Phil, that puts me right at 30 minutes.
Impeccable, sir, as if you had rehearsed that or something like that.